Oh, there we go.
There we go. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to introduce, Roifield Brown, who you've all heard from a second ago, and Dr Brettschneider, who will be speaking about the American Constitution. Just very small thing on adminning. If you want to have a chat, the chat thing is on the right. But if you want to ask a specific question, there's an ask a question along the bottom of the screen. Please use that for questions that we can then add to the Q&A when we get to that in about 20 minutes time. Thank you very much and enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everybody. Some of you will know that I produce maybe too many podcasts, and one of them is a thing called 10 American Presidents. I fell in love with the idea of America maybe about 12 years ago when Barack Obama became the president. And it was less to do with his politics, but more to do with the symbolism that I thought for the first time in my lifetime, America was truly living up to its founding ideals. So when I got into the world of podcasting, it wasn't a stretch for me then to investigate and kick the wheels of the American experiment constantly by doing first Mid-Atlantic and then 10 American Presidents. One of the great things about doing the show is you come by American thinkers, modern American philosophers, and one of them is Professor Dr Brettschneider, who has got a book or two out. He studies the American Constitution, and we've spoken on numerous occasions about what the Constitution means, what are the ideals of what it means to be an American. Corey, we've spoken on the podcast, we've spoken on the phone to each other. We even spoke at Intelligent Speech last year. Is the American Constitution more in peril in 2020 than it was in 2019?
Yes, unfortunately, I think it's both more in peril since we spoke about a year ago live in New York, and more important at the same time. And at the same time, I think people who joined us last time will remember I also was expressing a lot of hope, and I have that now too, and I'll say why. First of all, the thing that's in the news, of course, every day is the American presidency, and what this president is doing day in, day out, tweeting or whatever, is capturing the attention of America and the world, and we're thinking about this institution of the presidency. But what we also, I think, are seeing in some of the events, not all of them are relevant to this, but that when the president takes that oath in the first seconds of office, and lots of oaths are taken by American officials, but there's only one that's spelled out word for word in the American Constitution, and that's the oath of office of the President of the United States, and he has to take it in the first second of office. And there's a promise in there, a pledge to the president says, "I do solemnly swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." That's the job description. So, the worry is that this president hasn't always understood that and has brought us back to moments in history where presidents have been stopped. Like we talked, I think, in the introduction, and we might go into today, the question of the relationship between his treatment of investigations of himself and Nixon's treatment of the special prosecutor in Watergate, Archibald Cox. Except this president has gotten away with really, in one case, firing somebody looking into him in the recent past and in the more distant past, and basically avoiding the conclusions that Mueller brought in his investigation. So that's the danger. The hopefulness is that we've recovered before, and my next book is about how it's not the court that saves us, I show throughout American history. It's subsequent presidencies and citizens, like all of us, speaking out and saying, we want a president that's going to restore the Constitution. So that's my hopefulness, is that in the next term, this doesn't happen, by the way, by accident. It happens because citizens push. The Alien Sedition Acts, for instance, during the Adams administration are repealed by Jefferson and by newspaper editors who speak out. Of course, abolition revokes the Dred Scott decision in the most extreme way. that doesn't happen just because Lincoln is a good guy. He's pushed by Frederick Douglass and others. So that's my hopefulness.
Does it really matter then if there are so many checks and balances, if the president is a little bit of a demagogue, or doesn't really care, or doesn't care to learn or even know the basic tenets of the Constitution? You have enough other levers of governance, of restraint on a rogue president. So does it matter?
Yeah, I think it really matters, actually, because the mistake, I think, of what I just said, and the mistake that some people have taken from history, is that because the Constitution often has worked in the past and we've bounced back, we really don't have to worry about it when we have a demagogue president. And certainly we've had lots. We've Adams, I'll make the case, Buchanan, certainly Johnson, the first Johnson presidency, Andrew Johnson. But there were severe stresses on the Constitution such that the whole thing could have collapsed. And the recoveries are not accidental, but they're the result of massive effort on the part of the population. The thing that doesn't happen is that the courts save us. In fact, the courts often make it worse. And so I think it's exactly the opposite lesson, that we can't trust that there's no Constitution police, I say in my book, The Oath in the Office. It's up to us to basically push back. And if we don't, this is a statistic that I find totally frightening that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about. There are only 2 presidential systems in the world. And by presidential system, I mean, unlike your parliamentary system, a system of Congress, the president, and the court, 3 branches of government co-equal. There are only 2 in the world that haven't collapsed. One, and what I say by collapse, I mean that haven't suspended elections, had basically a collapse into dictatorship of a president. And the examples are the United States and Costa Rica, and that's it. And we've had, well over 100 presidential systems throughout history. So, yeah, there's a real danger.
Corey, that's a very interesting observation. And it's something which I say to my American friends all the time, that America is peculiar. And it's peculiar because to be a good citizen, on some level, you're supposed to believe in the Constitution, which is not the case literally anywhere else on the planet Earth. Canadians don't know the Constitution. Right. And it doesn't mean that you're a good Canadian or a bad Canadian.
Yeah.
Ditto the Brits, the Germans, the Costa Ricans, or the Nigerians. And America really lines itself up against a weird set of countries where to believe in the way that you are governed means that you're a good citizen. So it'd be someone like Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Iran, China, and these are not countries that you want to be bracketed with. Why is it, do you think, that the American Constitution, which was ratified in 1789, has so endured when others haven't? The French have had numerous in that time.
Yeah, I think the American Constitution plays a different role in American history than it does elsewhere in the world. I think usually countries, this is, sensible, see their Constitution, which are usually written more recently than ours. In almost all cases, France, for instance, changes its Constitution, multiple times throughout French history. That in our case, there's a sort of creed that goes along with it, a morality, a political morality. And so our politics, when we talk about politics in the best sense, we aspire to constitutional values of the founding, exactly as you talked about in the beginning. I was really struck by that. You were using a very American vocabulary and saying we finally lived up to our ideals. And to me, what's enduring about it is that, it's partly courts that speak that way. I teach constitutional law to future lawyers and, do the doctrine. But in a way, that's secondary in its importance to the fact that citizens have used that language in huge moments to fight back against really rogue presidents. And we've had some very bad ones, for all the talk of Trump. I think it's enduring this. And I think it's the necessity of it is because of the danger of the collapse, that it's something that we do when we start to veer towards the abyss, to the cliff, that we pull back by using this amazing tool that we have. And it's partly the power of it is its longevity, that it goes so far back. And then that the documents are so powerful. You know, they are these philosophical Enlightenment documents that are so connected to the true aspirations of human freedom. And it's also the drama of the failing. I mean, from the get-go, it is such a disaster to have side by side the worst institution in human history of American chattel slavery and these aspirations, and the drama, I think, of the tension between them. Great politicians, great presidents, and great citizens. Frederick Douglass, for instance, is the hero of my next book, who I have been just every day reading his work and reading about him, more enraptured by. He's the genius of American constitutionalism, because he's always able to show both at the same time. And, you know, a lot of people think you're not a radical. You talk about the Constitution. Frederick Douglass was the most radical of the abolitionists. You know, he said to Garrison, who had a heated rhetoric about hating the Constitution, you know, you're not doing anything. Let's get in there and start blowing stuff up. I mean, and John Brown, like, eats dinner with him. Right? The guy has got credibility as a radical at the wazoo, but he is, you know, a constitutional thinker through and through. So he's my hero. And my next book, I'm going to make that even clearer than I did in the last one. I certainly talk about him in the last one, but this next one is indebted to him.
It's interesting you talk about radicals who believe in the Constitution. You know, Jefferson believed that the Constitution should be rewritten every 20 years, didn't he? He said it should be a generational thing, you know, and ultimately Jeffersonian democracy is really at the end of a gun, ultimately.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, he said a lot of things, and he did, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was going to say he did say that, and he also, I mean, to me, Jefferson, you know, I'm struggling with him, frankly, because I'm writing about him now in the book, and he's a slaveholder. And he is a nasty racist. Like, there's no getting around it. He did oppose slavery. That's true. And, you know, thought it was a matter of time before it was rid. But he wasn't a person who thought of African Americans as equals, and that there was going to be a move from emancipation to equality. Not at all. So what do you do with him? And when you look at what Douglass or what David Walker, one of the first abolitionists, do, they just insist on not dismissing him and engaging him and pulling that tension out that you really see in his life. So he's as much, you know, a part of that tradition as anyone.
We've got a couple of kind of questions here. Remember, folks, you spoke. The best way is to hit the ask a question, but I'm looking at the comments, and Erica Johnson said quite a few countries have no constitution. As a Brit, we are always told that we're exceptional in that we have no written constitution. What we have is a certain set of precepts as to how the country should be governed, but there is no founding document. And most European countries were similar, but they all got invaded or had some kind of revolution, and that gave them the impetus, the chance actually to write a founding document. So there will be one for Norway, there will be one for Holland, etc., but there actually isn't one for the United Kingdom. So that goes to answer Paul M's question. No written constitution, right? Feels like MPs always talk about things violating the constitution. As I say, it's a set of kind of precepts, but there is no fundamental founding document that says the United Kingdom works like this. Another question, specifically, without being too partisan, and again, we did briefly touch on this in the last 10 American presidents, but without being partisan, can you just run through people who aren't that au fait, how is President Trump stress testing the Constitution? Give us like 3 instances.
Well, I mean, I wrote a piece when he was running that just, and people could just look it up, that documents line by line how each of his campaign promises, or many of them, were actually like admissions of constitutional violation. So I go, you know, through different provisions and outline them. I'll just give you a couple of the most drastic and obvious ones. The way that he talked about the original travel ban was that it was going to be a complete and total shutdown of Muslim immigration into the United States. And in our constitutional law, and now I'm playing a little bit law professor here, explicit distinctions based on religion, based on animus like that. Distrust, actually, is the court's language, are banned. So that's one. Now, I worked on the travel ban case, and so when I talk about the court not being there for us, it was clear that first travel ban was unconstitutional, but he started over time getting better and better lawyers. They rewrote it 3 times. They added North Korea to it, Venezuela, and obviously non-Muslim countries, and then said this is a totally different policy, and that's what the court upheld. So to me, those were clear smoke screens. 4 people came, for instance, from North Korea to the United States last year. You don't need a travel ban, and they were all admitted because we needed the information that they had. Courts aren't going to be the ones that really take a stand. That's part of the lesson, I think, of these years. Another one that I'll mention is the threat to torture the families of suspected terrorists. Now, as president, he's made good on those things. I mentioned the travel ban. I think the other really dangerous moment, there's one every week, but the firing of the U.S. attorney in New York who was looking into him has a feel of the Saturday Night Massacre. Going back to the Mueller report, that repeats a pattern of firing the FBI director, Mueller. Those were the things that Nixon did that brought him down, and this president has gotten away with it. Of course, the Ukraine phone call, we could go into impeachment as well, and you and I have I think it's an 1.5-hour episode about the history of impeachment that I think ends with Trump, but mostly it's about the history.
Mm-hmm. Will the American Constitution, the rules, the precepts, the precedents, be stronger at the end of this presidency? Or do you feel that they will need some obvious renewal?
I'm a big in the camp of renewal. I mean, that's my point. We're at a bad moment here, I think, which has a lot of potential. Citizens, you're seeing certainly citizen action in a way that we haven't seen since the 60s, and it probably goes beyond that in the United States. Now, how is that going to be channeled? I mean, I happen to think that Black Lives Matter is a constitutional idea and has to be connected to it. I mean, it's what Frederick Douglass was saying his entire life, and basically convinced the presidents of the United States, Grant and Lincoln, to come to his side, which they were not necessarily in the beginning. But that's not, again, inevitable. And my worry is a sort of inevitability of progress. And we do have this worrying language and worrying history of thinking things always get better in the United States, and they don't. The system is very fragile. That's why I gave that frightening statistic about Costa Rica and the United States.
We have a few questions. So, Luke, are you here, sir?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I had my mic turned off. I will throw the question open then. So this is from Rob, and he asks, I'm thinking in light of what I hear reported in the United States, that the concept of the separation of powers seems confusing to me. In the Australian, it is explicitly spelt out, and the High Court is not unwilling to remind politicians of that fact. Does the US Constitution spell this out? Because to me, the separation of powers goes to the heart of democracy.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with Rob. And I'll say this, the separation of powers and the idea of it, that the power of the executive is limited by the law. I mean, that's, to me, one of the core notions of separation of powers. And that's why both courts and Congress as the lawmaking body and courts as the law enforcement body have a task of overseeing the president. Now, I think that, and after the Nixon presidency, we did a lot in our country to reestablish the separation of powers. We created, for instance, the most important law, one of the most important ones in our history, the independent counsel law, that gave an ability of a prosecutor at the federal level to look into the president's wrongdoing with subpoena power and prosecution power, who wasn't fireable by the president. That was a response to the president of the United States, Nixon, firing the person looking into him, Cox. But Bill Clinton got rid of that law. And that was a huge erosion of the separation of powers. We also have the theory, really crafted, I think he gets the full credit, by a friend of mine and a colleague named Steve Calabrese, called the unitary executive, and adopted in a more radical way by John Yoo, But I'm very, I say that we're friends and colleagues, which we are, but I'm extremely critical of that theory. I think that's another way that the separation of powers has gotten eroded, and it really returns to a dangerous idea of atoms, that the president has to have complete control over massive portions of the federal government. And you even hear, unfortunately, Bill Barr talking about the unitary executive theory in terms of monarchy. Monarchy in Britain was actually a constitutionally limited monarchy, and yet they want to go beyond that. And Roifield and I have talked about that, and really bring back something that's much closer to a more absolutist idea of an elected monarch.
Excellent, yes. Thank you very much. I've got another one here. In the area of history, my podcast is covering now the early 19th century. The idea of establishing a constitution was a progressive, even radical demand, whereas today appeals to the constitution, in inverted commas, seem to have a small c conservative flavour. What are your thoughts on the lifespan of constitutionalism as a political idea and the future of this broad idea might hold?
I think that's a good general point. And, I've been saying we need to have a referendum on the Constitution in the next election from the moment that Trump was elected. And one of the pushbacks that I heard from political scientists, American political scientists, really echo that. And it's like, well, that's Republicans talk about that. And the sort of values that you're talking about aren't either Republican or Democrat, and it just won't work outside of, the Tea Party. And, that's been true, that often there's a sort of idea of going back to the 18th century that has an inherent conservative idea. And the philosophy of interpretation of reading the Constitution, called originalism, has that deeply conservative flavor for obvious reasons. You're returning to the past, the way that the words were understood in the past. But that's not the only way to read it. And throughout American history, to me, the constitutional heroes have found a way to move forward, have been progressives, not conservatives, while still thinking about, as Roifield said at the outset, the values of the Constitution. And that's what Douglas does. That's his brilliance. He talks about it as a political morality, a creed. He goes from an opponent of the Constitution saying things like, you call them self-evident truths, I call them self-evident lies, like a fun sort of bomb-throwing anti-constitutional rhetoric, to that same radicalism using the values. And that's really where his effectiveness comes from. So that's what I'm looking to as a progressive, not as a reactionary.
I've got a big one that I'm holding back for the end. But on the topic of separation of powers, I saw a comment that said that the framers overestimated the amount Congress would jealously protect its power and actively check the executive. Do you think that the balance will ever come back, or has that ship sailed?
I don't think it's sailed. I'm counting on it. And, as the book will say, we've had these cycles. And the last one, you don't have to look back to the 19th century or the 18th century to find it. Nixon's election is followed by and resignation under threat of impeachment. He's just as a reminder from those who saw the episode who haven't seen it, the House of Representatives votes several articles of impeachment, and rather than face impeachment in the full House, Nixon resigns under pressure from his own party. But to me, what's really important is what comes next. The Ford and Carter presidencies are Congress, the president and Congress, working together. Ford pardons Nixon, of course, but less known is he testifies before Congress about the pardon and did he make a deal, and subsumes himself with complete respect to that body. And they fight back with a series of laws, expanding rather than limiting their power. And that's what I'm saying we need. And I think there's no reason it can't happen. It will take a new, frankly, party in Congress to do it. But I think that is a good chance that will happen.
You honestly think we can roll back some of the power of the presidency in a meaningful way? Because it seems to me that as somebody who, student of American history, I'm not a professor like you, sir. But ever since the...
But you're an erudite.
Ever since the institution was founded, it's just accrued more and more power to the detriment of Congress.
I don't think so. I mean, there is a story, a lot of people tell this story that way. And, it's a common, I think, misperception that when you look at the way that American history is developed, it's fits and starts. Mm-hmm. So there are crucial moments in history, and they're rare, but where Congress takes an amazing role. And those are the moments of progress. fighting back against destruction, and they often come after the worst moments. So it's after the Civil War that Congress passes the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and passes legislation to enforce those amendments, like the Ku Klux Klan Act, which results in the prosecution of well over 1,000 Klan members throughout the country. And that includes actually liability, the famous Section 1983 of the Enforcement Act that says you can sue police. That's been eviscerated recently, but if you look at what's in there, it's all about Black Lives Matter. That's the point. It's the original legislation aimed at it. That's Congress fighting back against the presidency. If you look at the post-Nixon era, it's not just the Independent Counsel Act, it's the Emergencies Act, which is created to stop the president from unilaterally creating an emergency and gives the power to two houses of Congress, a mere majority, the ability to reverse it. And I could go on. You know, there's campaign finance legislation requiring public financing of presidential elections to keep the power of Congress equal to the president and not to allow the president to accrue massive amounts of money. So Congress does fight back. Now, does it happen all the time? No, but it's not linear. It's destruction followed by recovery. And that's why I think, you know, there aren't a lot of moments like this, but this is it. This is the moment that Congress can truly and needs to rein in executive power.
So, but just on that, with the fact that the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments show the muscularity of Congress, with the failure of Reconstruction and with Jim Crow, which institution should take the blame for that? In what way was the federal government lacking that those southern states could, in effect, nullify that and create a new demi-slavery to deny African-American citizens the right of full civic participation?
I mean, the destruction of Reconstruction is a perfect storm. It's all three branches bring about Jim Crow. American apartheid is really what it brings about. I like how you put it too. It's a new form of American slavery. And how does it happen? I mean, the presidency plays a huge role. I mean, in the book, I talk about Woodrow Wilson, who, as bad as he's been getting it, it's sort of like he said this racist stuff, is what I'm hearing. No, the man was devoted to the destruction of Reconstruction and nationalized white supremacy. So the president had a role. The court, Plessy versus Ferguson, is an enormously destructive decision, bolstered only by the Wilson presidency. And then something weird happens in Congress. You know, the Republicans basically get interested in business. They shift from really being this radical civil rights party, the most radical really that we've ever heard beyond that of the Democrats of the 1960s. And they give up. Hayes, also the presidency, that moment is a sort of, you know, the compromise of 1875, which is, you know, okay, sorry, we're going to pull out of the South, and, you know, it was a mistake. Part of it is the strength of the Democrats, who are such a nasty white supremacy party that the Republicans look moderate compared to it, but they don't have to go the other extreme. And so rather than polarize the country, the Republicans moderate and sort of let the white supremacists take over. And it really is all three branches that it happens in the presidency and the court taking the lead, I should say, and the Congress kind of, you know, giving up its power.
Yeah, I've got a question. I think this is going to be very much down your street. Isn't the weakness of Congress and the strength of the Supreme Court a big part of the problem, and can it be solved? As a European, I continue to be astounded how most social issues of the day in the US end up being settled by the courts rather than laws being updated to reflect the times.
Yeah, I mean, historically, I completely agree. The courts have been a disaster. You know, the Alien Sedition Acts, the Supreme Court Justice lobbies for them. These are acts prohibiting criticism of the president. Dred Scott, the worst decision in history that prompts the Civil War, encouraged by Buchanan, but certainly written by the Supreme Court. Plessy versus Ferguson, the moment that we were just talking about. And there are moments of renewal, I should say, for the court too. So I don't give up on judicial review. I think there are enough moments. You saw one recently, really defending the 1964 Civil Rights Act's application when it comes to gender discrimination and employment. That was a good moment for the court. But we can't be complacent. You know, I was a huge opponent of Justice Gorsuch, and especially, well, both, but Justice Kavanaugh when they were nominated. And most law professors, political scientists are sort of like, it's inevitable. But I just thought, you know, when you have people who are retrograde in their thinking, when they really are a danger to democracy, you've got to speak out against them. So we're in a bad moment with the court. I don't think it should be scrapped. It has to be reformed, and at its best, it can be an ally of Congress as it pushes forward American democracy. They uphold the 1964 Civil Rights Act, after all. But it's a danger, certainly at this point in history, yes.
Just on that point, and James Bolton is schooling me on some of the precepts of the British Constitution.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, James. But I'm kind of right in saying that there is no founding document, and it's kind of fundamentally on precedent. This is what you're saying about it's not codified, so it's a whole load of various rules. On the Supreme Court, we in Britain, our body, our Supreme Court body has only been instituted for about 15, 13, 14 years. It's not even 20 years. We had the law courts before, the law judges before. It's amazing what little visible part they play in UK life. Nobody knows who they are, and they're only allowed, I think, to serve for 10 years. I could be wrong on that, but it's not an office for life. You don't get it and then you can just die in it, or you just lose your marbles and then maybe someone will shuffle you out of it and stuff. Which, you know, the leader of the UK Supreme Court, she's a woman. I couldn't tell you what her name is. She has no public persona whatsoever. Just as a compare and contrast.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a difference. I mean, one thing that I'm trying to do in reference to the last question is to highlight justices who I think do the job well and live up to the ideals of the American Constitution, unlike the ones that fail to do so. Book plug, I have a new series with Penguin Press called Penguin Liberty, and it's trying to teach Americans about, and the world, about these issues. So we have the dissents and decisions of Justice Ginsburg, coming out in September, and then also Roifield, a companion really to what you and I did on impeachment, looking at all the documents. And you know, these things don't just happen. And I guess to go to the heart of the question about Ginsburg, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that we have this cult of personality around some justices, that they show you know, people need stories of people to personify the ideals, and she personifies the idea of the Equal Protection Clause protecting women and the aspirations of the Constitution that have been so unrealized for so long. So, you know, the court is political, and it is a sort of, in our country, charged with this defense of these high ideals. And so I think that goes along with it because it has such a role. And your court is so much newer and does so much less and has so much less history that it's probably not surprising.
Right, we've only got 5 minutes or so left. Then there's one I'm not sure you'll be able to answer it, Corey, but does Corey think Trump will be re-elected?
No, I mean, not right now. I think that the kind of perfect storm, you know, one thing I'll say is his numbers on the economy are very, very strong. And you can't discount that. I mean, historically, that has tracked large amounts of presidential elections have depended on. You have the famous line from James Carville during Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. But I think this time it's not the economy. And I've been saying maybe that should be the slogan of Biden's campaign. It's not the economy, stupid. People care about their lives and public health. And so that's going to play a role. I'd like to see the Constitution playing a bigger role, and I think it is. When I started talking about this, people are like, that's ridiculous. It's got nothing to do with presidential politics. But you do hear people saying, the Emoluments Clause has made a comeback. You can't profit from the office. The separation of powers and the rule of law. You can't just fire the people investigating you. So I think that's you know, enough to beat the economy, even if his numbers are, you know, the economy is bad, but his numbers are good on the economy. And even if that stays put, I do think he will and can be defeated.
Great, thank you very much. Do you want to wrap it up, Roifield?
If we don't have another question, so this has been myself, Roifield Brown, in conversation with with my friend Dr Brettschneider, who is somewhat of an expert on the American Constitution, but also being a typical American, is also optimistic about the future, whatever the present. So, Corey, thank you for coming on to Intelligent Speech and being part of our first session today, sir.
My pleasure.
We have got a couple more minutes. Sorry, I thought.
Okay.
I've got a question of my own then. How do presidential executive orders work with the Constitution, and what can and cannot be done by these orders? How can he make violating statutes illegal in terms of the Constitution? Just seems bizarre.
Yeah, that's great. It's actually the chapter 3 of the Oath in the Office is about that. Was an executive order. There's a great Saturday Night Live cartoon where President Obama sees a bill that's going to become a law. There's an old cartoon of how a bill becomes a law, and he pushes the bill down the stairs and brings up his friend, the executive order, who sings a song. I'm an executive order, and I pretty much just happen. There's no passage of bills, no debate, just do it. But, you know, the idea of an executive order can be harmless. It can be exactly what the Constitution requires. For instance, George Washington's first executive order just asked, like, what did the different parts of my government do? It's just an internal audit. Some executive orders implement legislation. So asking the Justice Department to look for instances where people are fired for transgender, for being transgender, that might be an appropriate executive order, especially after this.
But Corey, I'm confused. Why wouldn't that just be taken? Why wouldn't that just be looked after by the legislation that was in conflict with? Why would
because it has to be the law has to be executed. So it's one thing to have the Congress pass a law and the court opine on its meaning, but it has to be implemented. So, you know, the executive branch is 2.5 million people. So the benign executive orders are just doing the job of government, executing the law, making good on legislation. The Environmental Protection Act demands that certain birds be protected. Well, that has to be done somehow. And, you know, the details of legislation have to be carried out through executive order. But some executive orders are more nefarious. So one famous one by Truman is the seizure of steel mills during World War II because of a strike. And he was frustrated because he wanted munitions. And that is an overreach, the court says, in the most famous opinion about executive orders, Youngstown, that the president, we don't have emergency powers that give the president special powers in an emergency to do whatever he wants. The Congress said no to the ability of the president to seize steel mills. They considered it and rejected it. And so when he does that, they say that's the overreach. So the short answer is that presidents try to use executive orders for all sorts of things, but they rightly are limited. If the president wants to call out the military through an executive order, there's legislation limiting that. And, you know, we'll argue about whether it's within legislation or not. Unfortunately, Congress, and this goes back to our early discussion, after the Clinton presidency, really starting the Reagan presidency, has expanded executive powers so much. There's a problem of delegation, that Congress took a lot of its core powers and gave it to a president. And the Emergencies Act is an example of that. And so there's a slew of emergency orders now that of executive orders that really do encroach on Congress's territory. And those are areas where we need to explicitly push back through new legislation.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to say thank you very much. That was fascinating. And we'll hear from you
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Take care, Corey.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thanks for having me.